Good evening once again, and welcome to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. As always, we are happy to see so many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested people joining us virtually tonight. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as the interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute. The Taubman Center seeks to impact American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. This year, we've been placing special emphasis on the 2020 national elections and the events which have followed as a new administration and the nation grapple with issues of public health crisis, social justice, education, the economy, and commitment to the rule of law, with a roster of outstanding speakers and programs. Tonight, we present the 27th in our series of programs. We're honored to have 6 distinguished and accomplished journalists: Molly Ball from Time, Rebecca Ballhaus from Wall Street Journal, Gerren Gaynor from theGrio, Brittany Jones from the Black News Channel, Sahil Kapur from NBC News, and Jamil Smith from Rolling Stone. They will be introduced in a few moments by our moderator, but I would like to say just a few words about the program. I'm particularly excited about tonight's event, The Burden of Truth: How Journalists Navigated the Trump Presidency. I teach a course in political communication here at Brown and have emphasized the importance to the existence of American democracy of factual, truthful, and unbiased information. Over the past 4 years in particular, the trust of the American people in the information they are receiving was purposely eroded by leaders, especially the then president. I'm looking forward to hearing this diverse group of professionals describe the challenges that this environment posed for journalists in pursuit of the truth. Our moderator this evening is my colleague, Professor Jonathan Collins. Professor Collins is an associate professor of education and political science here at Brown University, where he also holds research affiliations with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform and the Taubman Center. Jonathan's research interests center on questions of racial and ethnic, minority political behavior, democratic governance, local and urban politics, and public policy, particularly education policy. He has written on race, empirical approaches to democratic theory, education finance, urban school reform, urban school governance, African-American voting behavior, millennial voting behavior, child care policy, political attitudes towards climate change, and more. His work has been published in Political Behavior, the Journal of Urban Affairs, Local Government Studies, and the Harvard Journal of African American Policy. His writings have appeared in the Washington Post, and he's currently an opinion editor, an opinion editorial columnist for Education Week. Jonathan was born and raised in Jackson, Tennessee. He holds a BA in English from Morehouse College and both an MA in African American Studies, as well as a PhD in political science from UCLA. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. It is also being live streamed on YouTube. And now I'll turn the microphone over to our moderator for the evening, my colleague, Professor Jonathan Collins.
Thank you, Professor Ehrenberg, and to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and to the larger Brown University community. It's an honor to be the moderator for this event tonight. Really special, star-studded panel that we have here today, and talking about what I think is an extremely important topic, which is, on the surface, it seems like we're just talking about the sort of nature of journalism, but we're really talking about the fabric of our democracy moving forward. And so I have this distinguished panel here with me today, and I'll just quickly introduce them because you all are tuned in to hear what they have to say, and I want to get straight to it. But before then, I'll quickly do some introductions. We have with us Molly Ball, who's a national political correspondent for Time. Molly Ball is a national political correspondent for Time, covering political campaigns, the White House, personalities, and policy debates across America. She is also a political analyst for CNN and frequent television and radio commentator. Previously, she covered US politics for The Atlantic and Politico and worked for newspapers in Nevada and Cambodia. She is the author of Pelosi, a best-selling biography of the first woman Speaker of the House. She has received numerous awards for her political coverage. We have Rebecca Ballhaus, who is an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal based in New York. She previously covered the White House and money and politics out of the Washington Bureau. In 2019, she was a part of the Wall Street Journal team that won the Pulitzer Prize, for national reporting in a series of stories on secret payoffs made to women on Donald Trump's behalf. She's not writing for the Wall Street Journal. She's a guest political analyst on several news outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. She joined the Journal in 2013 and is a proud graduate of our very own Brown University. We have Gerren Gaynor, who's the managing editor for theGrio. He's also the host of the Dear Culture podcast. The Brooklyn native is a graduate of Morehouse College, like myself, and a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism. Previously, he served as an editor at Fox News, BET, and Vibe magazine. Gaynor has reported a spectrum of stories in entertainment, politics, business, and education, and has written both political and cultural commentary. We have Brittany Jones, who's an anchor/reporter for the Black News Channel. She covers education, crime, community organizations, legislative sessions, Florida government issues, and weather. Outside of the newsroom, she is active in her community by serving as a mentor to young girls and an active participant in various organizations. We have Sahil Kapur, who is a national political reporter for NBC News. He previously worked for Bloomberg News. He has covered the 2016 US presidential election in depth, as well as Congress and the intersection of politics and public policy in the nation's capital. He appeared regularly on Bloomberg TV and MSNBC, and has also appeared on CNN, ABC, C-SPAN, and NPR. Previously, Kapur was a senior reporter for TPM, covering Congress and the Supreme Court, and an associate editor and reporter for Inside Washington Publishers, covering healthcare policy. He's also written about politics, policy, and law for the Huffington Post, The Guardian, and New Republic. And last but certainly not least is Jamil Smith, senior writer at Rolling Stone, where he covers national affairs and culture. Throughout his career as a journalist and Emmy award-winning television producer, he has explored the intersection of politics and identity. He specializes in reported analysis and commentary about the United States, politics, social justice, cultural identity, and sports. He is also a skilled radio and podcast host, moderator, and public speaker. Brown University community and those beyond, I present to you our very distinguished panel. Thank you for joining us. And let's get the conversation started. And so I want to start with just a very, very comfortable question of what got you into journalism? And we see you all on television, we read you all in print, but we don't really get to know you all sort of behind the content that you produce. Could you give us sort of a quick, maybe 1 to 2 minute spiel each, just giving us sort of your story, what brought you into the journalism field? We'll start with you, Jamil.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, Jonathan. The thing that got me into journalism was one love of writing and storytelling, but also my cousin was killed when I was in high school, and I realized that there was nothing in the paper about him. I mean, nothing in paper about the crime, anything, him being missing. And what I thought at the time was that there should be, there should be room for these kinds of stories. There should be room for the people who aren't spoken for. And I'd already been on the school paper, but it's one of the things that truly got me directed in this way. And certainly also writing a column in college, I grew, to have a love for commentary, and I'm thankful to be able to have a chance to do it professionally.
What about you, Molly?
Well, the short version is I just don't know how to do anything else, at least that anybody will pay me for. I started a newspaper in my neighborhood in the suburbs of Denver when I was in the 5th grade. So in retrospect, it's sort of inevitable that this would be the path I took. I mean, the way I look at it, we are people who like to gossip and complain. And those are two of my strong suits, right? Always wanting to be the one who gets the information first, knows the dirt on everybody. And then when something is effed up, I don't know what our content standards here, wanting to point at it and say, hey guys, this is effed up. Somebody should do something about this. So yeah, I mean, I have incredible respect for people like Jamil who feel some kind of calling to this work. But for me, it's I love to write. I love to tell stories. I'm not any good at writing fiction, so I stick to the facts.
How about you, Gerren?
Similar to Jamil, I started on the school newspaper. I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I knew I was good at writing, and I had wonderful mentors who told me I should write. And so I started writing commentaries for the school newspaper, and eventually began reporting stories. And I knew I wanted to be a journalist the moment I wrote my first reported story. I can't remember what it was about, but it was about something about the bureaucracy of the college campus at Morehouse. And the response from the student body really it triggered me. I was like, oh, people really care what I just wrote, and I just wanted to do work that has impact, that makes people feel something. But also, I always had a curiosity about people, and I still do. I psychoanalyze people is a really bad trait of mine, but I like to. But underneath that, there's this desire to understand people, as I was trying to understand myself. And I think that's what I love most about journalism.
What about you, Brittany?
I always have to go back, like just how she mentioned elementary school. So kind of funny story for me was that I love telling stories. Like my friend and I would just make up stuff. Back when we were kids, I would say in like 3rd grade, but we thought at that point we wanted to be a nurse. And then I went to high school to a magnet program, thought I wanted to be an attorney because I wanted to argue the truth, right? And it had to be like senior year in high school is when I decided, I was like, you know what? Honestly, I want to be a sports reporter. So I kind of went into, let me see how I would be able to do that. How could I be Pam Oliver? And got to college, I covered the Gators and had a chance to be able to do that because I have a love from sports, just growing up the way I did in my household with my 2 brothers playing sports. And then ultimately, when I got out of college, I kind of was hit with it's hard to find a job. And so my first job when I got it, ironically, ended up being a political news reporter for the state government for Florida. And so that's what started my trail of like telling stories. But what it was for me was the curiosity. I had a passion to obviously tell the truth, which is why I was interested in being an attorney at first, because I wanted to be able to argue the truth. And so now I have a platform where I'm able to actually tell those stories and allow people to get their truth out there. So that was my thing. It was like having to give people a way to be able to tell those stories and allow me to be able to do it and actually get in people's business, as Molly mentioned as well.
Very interesting themes that are emerging from these stories. Sahil, how about you?
I'm kind of with Molly. I don't really have any other skills. But so there were two moments in my life, I think, that pushed me to this. The first was the Iraq War and watching that collapse the way it did. It was the first time I realized, at least in my teenage years, was at the time that political leaders don't really know what they're doing, and they need to be pushed and they need to be held accountable. And it kind of made me want to be a part of that. And then in college, the 2008 election was something I just found far more exciting than anything going on campus. And by contrast, the writing and editing jobs I had at a couple of campus papers just seemed boring. So I started writing about the election, and eventually that led to an internship and another, and then jobs. And I've enjoyed it ever since landing here.
Rebecca, take us home.
I don't think there was any particular formative moment for me. I think I was a very nosy kid. I always liked to write. And when I got to Brown, I think that's when I really fell in love with this business of running a daily newspaper. I worked at the Brown Daily Herald, which I recommend. And when I was doing an internship the summer after I graduated at the Journal, I remember being so nervous to be around all these incredibly successful reporters. And when I was assigned my first story, I started making calls, and it was just like this sort of peaceful moment of like, you know how to do this, you know how to talk to people. So I think that's when I really realized that this was something I really like to do.
It's interesting the similarities in how you all sort of arrived at your passion through very unique experiences, whether it was a specific event or whether it was a kind of a reaction to something that was not necessarily a national event, but something more localized and something more personal. I think that segues to the next question that I really want to get into, which is, I want to take a moment and stop and, just kind of appreciate what this panel looks like. This is a very unique panel. Everyone on this panel is a part of a group who had to fight for the right to do what you all do now. Many of the journalists from the margins were very much motivated by their politics to break barriers. People like Jane Swishelm, who was likely the first woman to report on congressional news, and Alice Dunnigan, who was the first Black journalist to cover the White House. So can you all talk about your own personal background, how that factors into both the motivation to do your job and then sort of the challenges that you might face as a result of that?
Well, I'll get started. I think that, when I was a child, I was also, when I was thinking about getting into journalism, I was reading, Dwayne Wickham and, Bob Herbert and all of these, Black men, unfortunately, it's just Black men at the time, who were in, newsrooms, writing columns and trying to get their viewpoints, out to the people. And I studied that. I tried to get an understanding of what makes for a persuasive argument. What's the difference between argument in a column and argument elsewhere? And so I think what's changed is that, we now have, social media. They certainly didn't have to deal with that. And, certainly didn't have to deal with the unfortunate aspects of it, including harassment, things like that. I'm sure they had to deal, with unfortunate fan mail and all these other kinds of things. But, when you get notifications on your Twitter or Instagram that, and all kinds of vile things being sent to you, it definitely, I think, has a different effect on you. And I think that it shouldn't, deter anyone from, getting into this career. I certainly wouldn't encourage that, but I think it is something that people need to be mindful of.
I'll ask a follow-up too, just, and I'll tell it from the framing of a story that I like to tell about my very first university faculty meeting. And so when I was first hired here, we have faculty meetings for the entire university, and they recognize the new faculty, then the tenured faculty, and then the faculty promoted to full. And now myself, I stood up for the new faculty, and it was extremely diverse. But you saw that diversity start to wane as we moved across the promotion ranks. And now I'm curious for you, do you look in newsrooms and do you see a similar dynamic? And if so, what is that experience sort of like?
I think it depends on the newsroom. For one, it's been at times alienating, but also at times it gives me hope that I can avoid being the first and only. And Hand will be the first. It was the first Black person to be on the New Republic's masthead in terms of senior leadership in the 100-year history of the magazine. But being the first certainly doesn't, it carries a mandate. I think it means that you need to open up doors for people behind you. I think it means that you have to mentor those who are trying to understand how to get into this business. I came into media with no connections, a kid from Cleveland, Ohio, who didn't know anybody. And so how do you get into a business that you see as impenetrable? And I think it's incumbent upon folks in our position to make sure that we not only do our jobs as effectively as we can, but we also advocate for this business to change and improve, because I think journalism gets better when it is more diverse, when it has people who writing and broadcasting it who have more lived experiences with the things going on the ground.
Brittany, Rebecca, Molly, can you speak to the experience of being a woman in these spaces? How has that sort of both increase the motivation to be a part of this profession and show us what journalism and journalists look like, but then also increase the amount of challenges that come along?
Yeah, I mean, as Jamil was saying, there are people who went before us who paved the way, women who went before me who paved the way in journalism and in political journalism and in magazine journalism, and who I think also, it's pretty well known that there's often a dynamic of female competition, that women are often pitted against each other by our society. And I think women in journalism have done a tremendous job of pushing back against that and saying, no, we're here to bring everybody up. We're here to, mentor younger women reporters. I've been a beneficiary of that. I've tried to pay that forward to younger generations of women reporters. Politics is a very male-dominated business. And I got into political reporting because there was a job opening. I was a general assignment reporter, and the bigger paper in town was tired of me scooping them, and the only job they had open was covering politics. But it means that as a woman, it's a very good skill to get really good at talking about sports, for example, in order to make small talk with sources, just little things that, and that's fine. I like sports, but you come up with strategies to find ways to relate to people, things that you can have in common with people when very few of your sources, particularly when I started out 15 years ago, very few of the people you're covering are going to come from the same gender as you, right? And that's true of everybody who's coming from a different background, who's not white and male covering politics, since that's still the overwhelming majority of office holders. And so, of course, you get nasty comments. Everyone who covers politics gets nasty comments, and you develop a thick skin very quickly. And of course it's magnified. When you're a woman, that's what they pick on. If you're from a marginalized community, if you're a minority, that's what they'll pick on. But it's the truth that they have a problem with, not with you. That's who they're mad at. And so you get, I think when I'm out on the road talking to civilians, covering presidential primaries or whatever, and people want to know who's taking care of my kids. And I don't hear my male counterparts getting that question. And sometimes I'll say that, and people don't like to hear it. But again, I think, you have to find the middle point between letting things roll off you and sticking up for yourself when it's warranted. So I think we are on a good trajectory. And I think that, though, Professor Collins, the thing that you hit on is the arena where the progress really needs to be made is in the leadership ranks, right? We do see increasing racial and gender diversity, particularly in the lower ranks of journalism, but it has to filter upward. We need more top leaders who are not white and male to really bring the diversity of that experience to the whole industry.
I want to ask a question. Excuse me. I want to ask a question that I think dovetails off of this, but then steers us in another direction slightly. And that's the question that is at the core of this panel about speaking truth during the Trump administration. I got to ask, what was it like, the last 4 to 5 years? I mean, we have fake news is a part of the lexicon now. You have people who are fundamentally questioning the validity of the press and the media. You have journalists having to do fact checking at rates that seem to me extremely unprecedented, especially given how easy it is to access information now. Right? So how was it trying to produce content and keep the public informed in this environment where your profession is literally under attack on a daily basis?
I think I'll go first. I think that we dealt with a number of challenges when it comes to that, because there were so many things where, like you said, fact checking over and over again. And it's like our jobs are to tell the truth at all times, no matter what. So I think with that particular presidency, it was the one time that when things were just blatant lies, we had to allow it to just be told that it was a blatant lie. And whether it was bringing on guests to interview, to talk about it, to stress the points of why these things are happening, or what he completely said was just not true. I mean, it was our jobs to actually have to be that voice to be able to tell the truth each and every day. So I know we dealt with a lot of challenges of some people would say, oh, you're just posting things and skewing things one way. But it was like, at the end of the day, no, these are the facts and this is what's happening. There is no alternative facts, which we had also gone through during that era as well. And it was our jobs to actually just say, you know what, we vetted this and these things aren't simply true. And it allowed us to just have to be more vocal, I would say, about telling the truth to our nation, that these are, I go back to thinking about the one thing about putting, what was it, the Lysol injections or something like that. At that time, everybody remembers that during COVID, and people were like putting it out in memes, but simply our president said this. So it's on us to make sure we're telling folks, no, this is not okay. Here's what is actually happening. So I think that it forced us to have to be a little bit more vocal about things, because simply we just couldn't take lie after lie after lie without telling the public, like, this is not true. And anybody can say how they feel about it. But I know here, working especially for the Black News Channel, I'm in a different kind of unique position than the rest of the folks here, because our job is to talk to the Black and Brown communities and make sure that they understand what is simply just not true. And I know that's the case for every media outlet, but specifically our target is the Black and Brown community.
I would just say, add to that, if I can, Jonathan, the most lamentable thing to me is that we have become the story, and we keep becoming the story when we don't want to, and the vast majority of us, I would say, I know there's some exceptions, don't want to be the story. You know, that dynamic just makes convey what's going on in the world, but when we become targets, when we get portrayed as a villain, that changes the dynamic, and that creates a whole new layer of distrust for people who want to believe the person who's coming after us that way. That's where I feel some of the greatest damage to our institution. And that's one of many things, but that's the first thing that came to mind. It also gets at the identity thing, because I've never been personally comfortable being the story or being at the center of a story like that. And in terms of my identity, as an Indian American male, I'm not the most common demographic here. So I always felt the need to downplay that, if anything, when I was starting off as a journalist. I felt like there was nothing to gain. There was no editor who looked at their newsroom and said, what we really need is an Indian American male to hire, right? So it was just my calculation on that was very different.
The other thing I would say I've thought a lot about is showing our audience and showing readers more about how you do your reporting, because I think a lot of people don't always understand how much work goes into a story, especially when it ends up being a story that's attributed to something like people familiar with the matter. I think there's often this assumption that, you know, reporters are just calling up people who might know something and then taking whatever they say and putting it in the paper. And I think it's become so much more important over the last 4 years to show, you know, the amount of time you put into something, the amount of people you talk to, as much detail as you can give about who the people are and why they should know what they're talking about. I think that's become much more important, because I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is that people who supported Trump a lot of the times believed it when he said fake news, regardless of what proof you had, whether you had documents or whether somebody else came out publicly to back up your story. A lot of the times when he said something was fake, they just believed it. And so I think to the degree that we can sort of educate people about how the field of journalism works, I think that's just become even more important lately to try and counteract that.
you all are hitting on a topic I want to dive a little bit deeper into. And so, in addition to the kind of sort of fake news environment, you can look deeper, and we've been dealing with deep levels of political polarization in our politics going back for quite a bit now. What is it like being a content creator in this politicized, hyper polarized environment? Do you feel like there are certain audiences that you can't or won't even be able to reach? And how does that impact you?
Go ahead, Jim.
I think I can start because I have a very interesting journey through my career, because I spent 2 of Trump's years in the White House at Fox News, and for FoxNews.com in particular. And so I came in thinking that I could lead with my Blackness and my queerness, and push them forward, at least on the .com side. I think the network is a whole different story. And I found that it was a much bigger machine than I thought it was, and that some of the stories that I wanted to pursue didn't fit into Fox's, their image, and it was challenging because I was under the impression that they wanted to have diversity. They were hiring more LGBTQ+ people, Black people, and I realized that I could not really truly reach that particular audience, especially in the climate of Trump, because it was so polarizing, and to the point where talking about something that was centered around a Black person or a Black issue all of a sudden became politicized, and that was frustrating for me because I feel like my identity as a Black person, as a queer person, is not political. It's my humanity. And when certain parts of my humanity becomes politicized, I didn't really know what to do with that, which is why I ended up returning to theGrio in Black media, because I wanted to be able to have control over the audience that I'm speaking to, and have an audience that's receptive to the conversations and the stories that I want to pursue.
Yeah, I think that diversity only goes so far. It is important that we have diversity in our newsrooms, diversity especially in our senior leadership, people who are hiring. But if we don't have an understanding of commonality of facts, that then we can be telling people about our realities and what it's like for us. But then yes, the audience can be limited, and I understand that there's still value in, even if you are technically preaching to the choir in some instances, there's still value in that, because a lot of those people in the choir have family who are not in the choir. And if you arm those people with facts and good argument, then that's another mechanism for change. You are pushing candidates, even ones who are quote unquote on your side of the argument, to be better, to improve their platforms, to apologize when they've done the wrong thing, to do all the things that actually help improve our politics as a whole. Then it's still useful. Yes, you may not get Donald Trump to read your columns or your reports. Or people who like Donald Trump, but there's still a lot of value in getting the other, several, dozen million people who don't follow Donald Trump, or don't subscribe to those beliefs, to pay attention to what you're doing, because this country has a lot of ideologically diverse families, and really at the beginning, that's where it starts.
Oh, go ahead, Molly.
Sorry, yeah, if I could just jump in on that. I think, some of this stuff is not new, right? Politicians have always insulted the media as a ploy, as a tactic. And I wish the targets of that tactic, their audience, understood that they are being used by this tactic, that the politician is saying, I want you to believe me instead of the truth, because the truth makes me look bad. And that's why they're picking on us. I started covering politics for one of the most conservative newspapers in the country. So I'd go to the Nevada State Democratic Convention and they'd say, boo, the Review Journal, we hate you. Then I'd go to the Nevada State Republican Convention and they'd say, boo, the liberal media, we hate you. But we have to retain that sense of independence. And I think almost as damaging as being told, nothing is as damaging as being depicted as, the enemy of the people and all that. I don't want to draw false equivalence. But, it is almost as damaging that we have been lionized by so much of the left and held up as heroes, because we're not on that team either. And I think there's a real danger of people in our profession, and you see it all over. There's an unrealistic expectation. You see, random Twitter progressives all the time now have this expectation that the press is on their team, and we're not on anybody's team, right? We have to retain our independence and our lack of sympathy for either team or any team in whatever multifaceted environment, so that we have, the confidence that we are not being, swayed or spun, and that the truth that we have come across, that we have dug up and found out and reported, that's what I was looking for, that it's the honest truth, right? And not that we're not carrying anybody's water.
Right. And if I could just add on one thing onto what Molly was just saying, I think it's really important that, we educate all of the people who are listening to us, not merely about the fact that we're not supposed to take sides, but also to help them engage in what we're actually advocating, which is critical thinking, which is intellectual honesty. That to me, I think is one of the main missions of the press. And if we are getting people to think in a little bit more deeply about the world around them, to question things that should be questioned, even if it's quote unquote on their side, I think that's us fulfilling our mission.
There's a line of argument that the golden era of media consumption was this Walter Cronkite, everyone sitting in the living room, gathered, watching the nightly news special. Everyone's consuming information from the same outlet. There aren't all of these different platforms and mediums through which people can get information. And therefore, we don't have all of the biases that come along with the variation in all these different networks and outlets. How do you all sort of respond to this kind of criticism of sort of new media? All of you all are talking about the importance of, regardless of media and platform, speaking truth to power. Yet media platforms are sort of categorized and placed on this kind of continuum and labeled as liberal, as conservative, and not as different mediums that are just looking to speak truth. So, how do you sort of respond to the kind of criticism of modern media?
Do you mean specifically whether we're talking about social media platforms, like social media, IG and Facebook and Twitter and things like that, and kind of navigating those things?
Yeah, the fact that we have social media, the fact that we can have reporters from Time, from the Wall Street Journal, from NBC, from Rolling Stone, from theGrio, as opposed to one or two or three outlets that everyone sort of goes to. Now we have all these options. Now it's entrepreneurial. But we see this entrepreneurial nature as a downside because, again, we want to place the different outlets on some sort of liberal conservative continuum.
Well, this panel would look very different if, we were in the old days, right? I don't know how many of us would be hired in an old school, or I don't know, in the 70s or 80s type of media. But the most important almost doesn't matter because there's no going back to that phase. We're just in a new world now, but it's also worth seeing the upsides and the downsides of it. There are upsides to the democratization of media. Anyone who is in a moment covering a protest, who sees something, can have it immediately within moments seen by thousands or potentially millions of people. We saw that in the George Floyd protests. It was massively influential. We've seen that around the world and revolutions that have happened. That is one huge upside of the democratization of media, that everyone has a platform and that everyone can be a journalist if they want. The biggest downside of it is the proliferation of hoaxes and just nonsensical stuff that people can go to and convince themselves is real. And everyone has their own preferences, and everyone can kind of build their own bubbles and convince themselves that that their bubble is the truth, when in some cases it's not.
I think it does force us to have to do a lot more going against what people put out there. It's a lot more fact checking that's needed at this point. You would notice even like sometimes when you post about anything about COVID and the CDC has a thing that pops up automatically in terms of just basically saying this is not true. It forces us to have to say a lot about like the work that we're doing so that people understand that we're the ones that are putting out like the news that is actually factual. And, you know, sometimes people are like that Sahil mentioned, so quick to like post things. And it's almost like sometimes we have to go back and like tell the real story of what happened because all they see is what they got out very quickly. And we have to go back and almost dispel the myths, if you will, about the type of information that's put out there. So I think it speaks to the fact that real journalists still do matter and that our jobs still have a solid place because we are the ones that are actually going out and vetting this information that people are putting out there.
I have a follow-up question too, just about how you separate person from profession. And I'm thinking about particular events. And so I imagine what it must have been like to be you all during the insurrection at the Capitol. You know, so on one hand, you know, democracy is literally under attack, and you as a contributor to the press and the media, you are our primary defenders of democracy. And so, what was that moment like for you all? And you know, I know Sahil and Rebecca, you've written on it. I believe Molly, you've written on it too. Jamil, you've written on it. Brittany, you've spoken on it. And Gerren, I think you've reported on it as well. You know, can we talk about that moment and what that meant and how that experience was for you all? And Rebecca, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, of course, it was a horrifying moment. It was very scary to watch what was happening. I think I knew that none of my colleagues were in the building that day, but it was horrifying to watch and think about what could have happened. But I do think that in moments like that, and when COVID started, I think that reporting has been something that has made me feel like I have some agency when there's something that's really scary that's happening, that where people feel largely helpless, that being able to actually report on something and try and get to the bottom of it and try and answer questions that people have is something to do that's not just like freaking out about what's happening. So I think for me, my job has really helped me in those moments because when the riot happened, you know, a team of us threw ourselves into figuring out like, who was it that organized this and who financed this? And we did a story that showed, you know, where the money came from for an earlier event that preceded the riot. And it just made you feel like you are doing something productive that's not just thinking about this horrifying, scary thing. So for me, I think that I have really, you know, if anything, worked harder in those moments and wanted to work more because it's something productive to do that's not just being scared.
Yeah, I have to agree with Rebecca. I'm just realizing that now. It wasn't until she said it that it really resonated with me. But yeah, that day was a very busy, tiring day because we were just in the thick of it. But for me, I would just say on the human side, it was incredibly heartbreaking, not just to see our democracy literally being attacked, but as a Black person, and you know, I'm speaking really for my audience. As Black people, it was heartbreaking to see because we knew that underneath this attack was a reverberation or a pushback against the impact that Black voters had in states like Georgia. And so for us, it was like we were witnessing white violence and white terror, which has a long history on this land. And so it took me a few, I would say a 24 hours to really take in what had transpired because I was so focused on the work. But then much like many events like the 2020 protests, and even the COVID pandemic, as a Black person, you sit back and you have to also take in the emotional and psychological trauma that these events can have on you, even as a journalist, because sometimes I feel like being a journalist, sometimes you can be numb to what's happening. And I try my best to not do that, but it's difficult because you're focused on getting the story and getting it reported, and in the case of digital media, sometimes getting it up quickly, which is a challenge for journalism as well.
Can I add also to what Gerren said?
Please.
Okay, so Gerren, it also for me working here at BNC, I was on the desk that day, actually just covering the back and forth between the Senate and the House, doing the certification of the results. And it was, I remember like I heard like a loud thumping and I'm going, what is that in my ear? And then I see all of the lawmakers, rush across the room. And then I happened to check Twitter and I saw videos of like the rioters pushing their way into the Capitol. So then I put two and two together. I'm like, okay, something big is happening right now. And I remember my heart sank and I'm going, what is happening here? Just like everyone else. So we happened, like I said, to be on air at that time. But what stung to me was when we did our interviews throughout the day and we brought all of these people on our show, and the different things that folks would say was that Black people in a different, unique sense were upset because the protests that happened last year, they weren't handled the same way as what we saw at the Capitol. And so we brought a lot of angry people on the show and people posting on our social media pages about if those folks who had been Black, what would have happened to him, what would have happened to them. And there would have been mass carnage at the Capitol. That was their feelings. That's what they shared with us. So watching from that perspective was a whole different thing for me, and hearing these different stories of how people felt, that became the driving conversation here at our network. So I just remember that day in particular, and those stories continued to be told throughout the week and the months after the insurrection happened.
And if I may, just to connect this question to the previous question, I mean, it just shows you the value of outlets like BNC, like theGrio, these descendants of these, of the Black press. We had so many, it wasn't just Walter Cronkite out there, giving the truth to people. It was the Amsterdam News, it was the Colin Post, all the Chicago Defender, all these different newspapers that have existed for, sometimes 100 years, depending upon the outlet. And we've had to have these outlets within our communities, not merely because Black people were excluded from mainstream newsrooms, but also because, frankly, they weren't, getting the stories told about their communities in those mainstream newspapers, despite, maybe sympathetic white reporters, in the way that they saw it. They needed it through their lenses. And honestly, that's, even though I work for a predominantly white outlet, I still try to exemplify that. And what I saw on that day, I try to then amplify a Black perspective, my Black perspective about what happened, what I had been seeing. And yeah, I mean, I didn't really see a bunch of, people with red hats and, breaking windows. I mean, I saw a lynch mob, and that's what came to mind for me. And I think we need to have those perspectives in our news, because we need to have people understand that, history echoes, and we need to have people understand the context of what they're seeing, not merely understand the facts of what happened.
I have a question that kind of takes us into, if we can think about the insurrection as kind of an awkward kind of apex of the Trump administration, or that transition from Trump to Biden. I want to transition to us to thinking about now President Biden. And so there's a concern that after 4 years of Trump, that the public has developed something like a Trump fatigue. And that now there's a danger of journalists being too soft on Biden, because now we have a president who isn't openly critiquing the press constantly, and that isn't undermining the credibility of the press. Is this a concern now? That now journalists, after being under attack for 4 years, now are not being tough enough and critical enough of President Biden? Sahil, I could get
if I can respond to that. Yeah, so this goes back to Molly's point earlier, that journalists who are covering the Trump administration were doing so aggressively with an objective standard for how you cover a president who's behaving that way. There did develop an expectation among certain viewers that journalists were approaching it from a perspective which was not the case. And we see this on Twitter, the same tactics, like for instance, showing a lawmaker a certain tweet and asking them to respond. The same people who loved reporters doing that in the Trump era aren't so happy when reporters do that in the Biden era. And that's the kind of thing that we need to fight against on one hand. But on the other hand, there is, I do feel a responsibility as a reporter not to act like every presidency is, or each president's are equally scandalous now is necessarily equivalent to what Trump was doing in the last few months of his presidency, that anything Biden has done so far has compared to the previous president's refusal to accept the election result and the regularity with which he would kind of make things up, to be frank. So there is that balance that we have to strike between being accountable, between being fair, being objective, but also not drawing a false equivalence.
Rebecca, Molly, you have thoughts on it?
Fatigue. I think that a lot of people did get tired of Trump, but they still had an incredible appetite for all things Trump because he was so good at being scandalous and making news. And as much as, as a political reporter, I love always being on television, I do look forward to a recalibration of perspective where politics is just one of the things we cover. I think it's insane that cable news is all politics 24/7 when there are plane crashes and natural disasters and policy issues and social issues in people's lives and all kinds of things happening that shouldn't be on our beat. And we shouldn't be the ones in there commenting on them. And I wish that there was more coverage, of local news and things that are happening in people's communities. As a former local reporter and as someone who thinks that the biggest threat to our industry right now is the erosion, the decline of so much local news and the closure of so many local newspapers. But yeah, I think we could all stand to see a little less politics, and I think our audience would welcome that too.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, to the question about reporters going soft on Biden, the only thing I would say is that I think a lot of newsrooms staffed up massively over the last 4 years. And I think you've seen like these investigative teams grow and these quick strike investigative teams. Our own White House team, I think, was like 3 or 4 people under Obama, and it's still 6 or 7 for Biden. So I think that reporters did get used to a certain pace of coverage over the last 4 years, and it's going to take a while to sort of adjust to maybe there not being as much news to always feed that as there was with Trump.
I think it's also incumbent upon the audience to reset their expectations. I think, to a large degree, I see journalists doing a lot of the same excellent work that they have been doing prior to Biden's inauguration. And the fact that, the news is simply different and, maybe reminiscent of presidents past, folks are going to, have to demand the kind of coverage, that they're going to receive. And what they've been demanding, unfortunately, to a large extent, is, stuff that revolves around these micro, stories around Trump that really, didn't amount to much more than gossip. Now, we have a lot more substantive issues to handle. There's not many scandals, at least thus far in the Biden presidency. So we're just covering the news. And folks, if they're not satisfied with that, need to tell us exactly what they're looking for.
I'm curious, in addition to thinking about, the transition to from covering Trump to Biden, just covering politics, period. I mean, Trump showed us how contentious politics can be. And, in America, we have this ethos of we don't talk about politics at the dinner table. Politics is this very contentious and divisive thing, and we stay away from it. Yet you're speaking about it, you're covering it every day. And so how does that affect your not only just like your career and what it's like being a journalist covering politics, but like, what is it like when you're off? When you're hanging out with friends, when you're having dinner, having brunch, before the world was over. And then, everyone knows that you have these, these political takes and these conversations that you're having publicly.
I think it forces us, first off, you have to watch what you say as a journalist. We all have our opinions. Even down to family members. Like, I have to tell my mom, if she's watching, like, you got to be careful with like what types of signs you want to put outside of your house and all of those things. It just forces us to have to be a little bit more censored, if you will, because we can't give our opinions on what we think about things. So I listen to my friends and family members talk about politics, but rarely do I divulge in the conversation in that way, unless we're discussing like the blatant lies and stuff that you really just couldn't ignore. But in terms of like opinions and things like that, I have to just keep quiet, as much as I would like to say something sometimes, because as we're humans at the end of the day, and there are things that actually absolutely upset us. There were things that happened during the Trump administration that upset us as Black people. So there are things that sometimes you're just like, okay, you know, you really can't be vocal about it. You want to say something, you might have wanted to post something, but you just really can't do it.
I would say even
I'll
those of
just
us who
add to
can
that briefly,
give our
there's-
opinions. Oh, go ahead, Sahil.
No, you first, you first.
Okay, yeah, I said for those of us who actually are allowed to give our opinions in print, it's still tough sometimes. I mean, first of all, you're regarded as you know, I guess a walking cable news channel. You know, people want to ask you questions, people want to, like, you know, get into politics. And I don't know about, you know, the rest of the folks here on the panel, but I know that I like to switch off when it's, you know, when I'm writing, when I'm into it, when I'm reporting, what have you, I'm on. But when I'm off, I'm off. And I think we have to do that to some degree for our own sanity. But I think, you know, and it's not, you know, ill-intentioned, but I think folks see what we do, know what we write about, and then say, okay, well, I want to ask them about this, and this, or vent to them about my frustrations about Trump for this, you know, period of time, and without really any regard to what we're dealing with. And at that point, you know, we just have to really, even those of us who give our opinion, be careful that we don't say anything that we don't have reporting on, or don't have, you know, information about, that we're not educated about. I just try to be as careful, frankly, as when I'm writing, you know, not to say anything or speak to anything that I don't know.
And in a certain way, I mean, it is good when people are more politically aware, I think, more politically conscious. And again, maybe that's my bias as a political reporter, but my reason for saying that is politics has really high stakes for people's lives, and that's always been the case. And for some people, maybe it took, you know, the Trump presidency to recognize that. But a big part of my job is to try to convey the stakes of politics, to convey the stakes of elections. What will it mean for your life if the Senate flips this way, or the House flips that way, or this president or that president wins? What will it mean for your ability to buy healthcare on the exchanges? How much, you know, what will it mean for your ability to pay 10% or 8.5% of your income on your health insurance plan? What will it mean for the taxes that you pay next year? These things are really important. And even going back to an era where politics was boring, they still impacted people's lives. So to the extent that people are more conscious of that, I think that's a very good thing. Now, having said that, it does make for a lot of more awkward conversations on the Thanksgiving table.
Any more comments on this particular issue? I just think it's particularly interesting because when people see you on television, you know, they associate you with your work, and then when they run up to you on the street, I'd assume that that's the first thing that they want to talk about. And some of you are just saying, look, I just want to go in TJ Maxx.
Mm-hmm. I just want to get ice cream or something like that. I really don't want to talk about that right now. Like, it's been a long day, it's been a long week, it's been a long 4 years, whatever it is. I just want to get ice cream.
Well, people want to argue with you about something that you've said, and really quickly, because we're out of time, but just the social media dynamic. You can say something on Twitter and then get immediate responses, DMs, people who don't have profile pictures, but that are just looking to kind of stir the pot. You know, how has this kind of complicated the nature of the job, especially covering politics?
Everyone should use quality filter on that stuff. Can weed a lot of them out.
Yeah, I mean, my
Amen to that.
friends always say that everybody went to school, so everybody thinks they know how to do their job, do your job. And I think it's very similar with political reporting. Everybody votes, so most people, so they think that they know as much about politics as you do. But if we're doing our jobs right, a lot of what we do is listen to people. And yes, we need to be able to clock out and have private time. And hopefully, you know, we're not such celebrities that we can't go about our business. But, you know, when you, for example, if you cover a lot of Trump rallies, you run into people who don't want to talk to you because you're a journalist, you're the fake news media, you're CNN, whatever. But most people, a lot of people they're there because they want to be heard, right? The reason people participate in politics is because they want to be heard. They have a point of view that they want to express, and they feel people in power aren't listening. So when you can do people the service of just humbly listening to them and caring about their point of view and what they want to say, whether it's a Trump supporter, a Biden supporter, someone who doesn't vote because they've checked out because they don't feel they're being listened to, or whatever else. And a lot of these people are going to be weird or nonsensical or whatever, but they're humans. And that's what at the heart of it we should be doing, is helping people understand the ways that their individual perspectives come together in the democratic system in some very clumsy and imperfect way to try to govern this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can just add to what Molly was saying, I think empathy is a skill, and I think it's a necessary skill for what we do. And as much as we may get tired and want to say, hey, listen, I'm off. I've heard this rant about Trump 15 times. But people, it deeply touches their lives, and we actually may learn something from their perspective. So it pays for us to not merely to sympathize and empathize, but also to just, like Molly was saying, just to listen, to always be aware, because you never know, necessarily where the next story may come from, where the next angle may come from, where the next argument may come from. And so I've gotten lots of columns out of just listening to people, vent about the world, and it presses me to then investigate and do a better job. And so yeah, I think it's very, very important that we are always journalists at all times, to the best of our ability.
I like that now you're speaking to the sort of like human aspects of being journalists. And I think this is the perfect way to transition to our Q&A. And so we're going to lead off the Q&A with a couple of questions from actual Brown students. We're going to start with Finn Loudon and Ben Pollard, who are both undergraduate students, but then also journalists with the Brown Daily Herald. So Finn, Ben, I will leave it to you.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking tonight. Finn and I have a two-part question. I'll start with the first part. How have the increased focus on national news combined with the closures and layoffs of local newspapers affected the industry in total? Specifically, has it led to a blind spot in certain types of reporting, and what political consequences might that have?
And then
Excellent
question. Go ahead.
I can ask the second half of our question as well. And then just in addition to what Ben was mentioning about the impact on political instances, we're also interested just in terms of the impact on local businesses and community cohesion. Molly, you touched a bit on just the myriad of topics that sometimes aren't covered when the politics focus is so intense. So just we're curious on that aspect as well.
Molly, you want to start us off, or Jamil?
Sure. I don't want to monopolize the airspace here, and I'd love to hear other people's perspectives as well. But I do think it's a crisis, the erosion, the vacuum of local news in so many communities. I mean, I'm from Denver, where we had 2 daily newspapers when I was growing up, both of them robustly staffed. Now one of them's out of business and the other is a shell of its former self. And there are some, digital organizations that have started to spring up to try to replace them. But, as much as we talk about the importance of holding politicians accountable and speaking truth to power, that's only part of what we're here for. We need to also just be giving people information about their communities, information they can use to be informed or to know how to get the vaccine or whatever else. And I think it's really been felt during COVID, when so many politicians who might in other circumstances be abusive toward us suddenly realized they needed us because they needed to get information out to people. And, we are the vehicle for that, because we hopefully, ideally, maybe not so much anymore, have the credibility to say to a certain community, I'm one of you, I live in your town, I'm part of this community, I also have a stake in it, and I am here to, give you information that doesn't serve anybody, that serves you, the news consumer, the reader, the viewer. And so when politicians have information that they want to get out for their own purposes, you know, we are the filter that says, well, wait a minute, you know, some of this stuff isn't true, some of this stuff is misleading, some of this stuff isn't helpful to people, some of this stuff is just poorly written, and we can do a better job of presenting the information. But, you know, I think, you know, we are an important we should be an important part of people's communities. And, you know, when you talk about that issue of community cohesion and polarization, you know, we have so many conversations in this country about the you know, the tearing of our social fabric and how divided we are. And I think it is the erosion of local news that contributes to people feeling that way, right? I remember going to a small town in Western Wisconsin several years ago and sitting in on some focus groups with locals in a rural area. And one of the things they said was, you know, we used to have local stations, but now we get all our news from Minneapolis. And that was something that really contributed to their sense of alienation, their sense that this country didn't have a place for them or wasn't interested in listening to their points of view. So I don't know what the answer is. If I were any good at capitalism, I would have gone and done that instead. But I hope that people who are good at, you know, making money off things, figure out a way to make this profitable so that there is a future, particularly for local journalism, because it's so important.
Yes, just to chime in on that, I think one of the solutions is newsroom diversity. I know we were speaking to that earlier, but I think when you know, I'm also from a town, Cleveland, you know, where it had a paper is basically a shell of itself. And I think that even if you're talking about local newsrooms, or, you know, newsrooms for national outlets, it's really important that we, one, not consider local news to be off limits, or, you know, say if there's a story happening in New York City that we just think, oh, well, that's just, you know, too much about New York, too New York centric. We need to understand that, you know, these local stories are relatable throughout the country, and if we are going to help people, you know, develop an understanding for how people live in different parts of the country, it is important for us in the national media to, you know, tell those stories. But also, it's important for people, you know, in the newsroom to have diverse perspectives so that we can understand which of those stories have value. Sometimes some of these stories that happen locally are not, you know, not really judged to be newsworthy. We've seen, you know, a flood of reports about Trump voters, whereas, you know, there are lots of, you know, African-American voters in underserved neighborhoods that did not get such scrutiny or attention. So I think it's important for us, you know, if we are going to venture, and we should, more into local reporting, that we make sure that we're telling, you know, the entire story, just as we do with the country.
Now, just add from a Black news perspective, we get a lot of requests, a lot of business owners and people of communities across the country wanting theGrio to amplify their stories and the struggles that are happening in their communities. And we are a national news site that services a very niche community. And that's challenging because we can't reach everyone. And there's an innate desire to tell their stories, but we are also we also suffer from budget issues, and we have a small team, and we can only do but so much. And I think that I don't have a solution for how the business aspect of journalism and that role in the decline in local publications. But we are seeing a rise of independent journalists who are, you know, reporting stories, and some might call them bloggers, some might call them journalists, and that's a whole different, I think, panel to have about what is a journalist and what are bloggers and can bloggers be journalists. But I would encourage those who have this innate desire to amplify stories and put the truth out there to think about doing it on your own without the backing of a business. And I think that's challenging, but that's kind of the state that we are in with social media and the impact of this proliferation of information. You can get it anywhere on the internet. And I think it's a really challenging issue.
And people talk about, you know, the collapse of local journalism as a crisis for the profession. I prefer to think of it as a crisis for the country. I mean, if you think of journalism as a mechanism to hold powerful people accountable, then an enormous amount of power is accumulated and executed at the local level. It doesn't even make it to the national level. And if you don't have journalists trying to shine a light on that stuff, a lot of people, can just run amok with it. And that hurts the people around them. That limits accountability. That allows people who didn't have their actions sufficiently vetted to try to rise to the national level and try to get following them and kind of scrutinizing them every step of the way, and conveying to the public, giving them a sense of whether or not of what they're doing and the extent to which they deserve to be there, or allowing them to make informed opinions about the extent to which they should be there. So that's just one way, I think, in which the collapse of local journalism hurts.
One thing I think that really showed holes left by the shrinking of local journalism is also the vaccine rollout, because one thing that really struck me was when DC started making people eligible to get the vaccine who were below the age of 75 or whatever it was. All of a sudden, it was everything that was on my Twitter feed was about that. And I just felt like I knew everything about what was going on with the vaccine rollout in DC, whereas so many of these other places, you just have a very limited picture. And so since joining our investigative team, I feel like that's something where I've really felt a responsibility to look beyond, the places that I am, the places where the people I know are, and try and, get a fuller story, because I think for something like the vaccine rollout, there's so many stories of abuse that have to be revealed, and not just in places like New York and DC.
Yeah, the vaccine rollout opens up so many questions about accountability and fidelity. And Finn, Ben, thank you so much for your questions. We have another student, Kimberly Collins, no relation, who's going to come in, and she has another question that she wants to pose to the panel. And I think it springboards very nicely off of Rebecca, your last comments. I'm interested to get your thoughts and the rest of the panel. Kimberly?
Hi, thank you so much for being and speaking at Brown today. It's really an honor. So my question is, a historic moment of the Trump presidency included the attack on reporter Yamiche Alcindor, who was called threatening by the president during a coronavirus press briefing. And this incident was one of several in which President Trump made remarks to Alcindor in ways that perpetuated harmful tropes of Black people. To what extent does this blatant disrespect to journalists, particularly journalists of color, have a broader impact on the respect given to journalists in the field? And additionally, have you all experienced comparable incidents in which your questions were made to seem unintelligent or improper?
I would definitely say it was upsetting to watch that, right? I hadn't experienced that myself, to where I felt like people kind of undermined me as being a Black journalist. But I will say I have witnessed microaggressions in the field. I remember one time where I was showing up to someone's house, and what we get called a MOS, man on the street. And it was a neighborhood, something happened, and I stopped in someone's house to do a door knock to see if I can get an interview. And I remember one particular case where this guy, he made a comment to me, and he goes, "Oh, you speak so eloquently." And I was confused by that type of comment, because here I am as a journalist. I've gone to college, graduated from the University of North Florida. Do I know where I graduated from today? University of Florida. And he's making this comment to me, and in that moment, I didn't know what to say back. It's like minimizing who I am because I'm Black. So I do feel like it might have not come from necessarily always like an actual official, but it's actually come from people who I've stopped to interview on the street. And in that moment, I just remember being like, saying, well, thank you. But there were so many things that were going through my mind at that point where I wanted to address it. But here I am, a little MMJ out there alone, and I didn't know how to actually speak up for myself at that moment. I'm very vocal about things when things are wrong, but in that situation, we're always taught that we want to go home that night or whatever the case may be, but I was alone and I didn't know how to address that. So, watching what happened with the president and the reporter, it's disheartening to watch it, because here we are, we're always trying to do our job and to also just be able to tell the truth. And it was almost like steering her in a way that she was not allowed to be able to do her job, just simply because he didn't like what she was saying.
And that type of interaction between Trump and Alcindor also happened between him and our White House correspondent and DC bureau chief, April Ryan. And those type of interactions make it incredibly unsafe for Black journalists, especially Black women journalists. April had to hire her own security. Even this year for the Biden inauguration, she decided not to go in person because of the Capitol riots and the ongoing harassment that she has received from Trump supporters and these trolls online. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced that personally also. Again, I did work at Fox News, and so certain stories that I had wrote that were not maybe pro-Trump, oftentimes would result in me getting messages from, I'm assuming, supporters who are calling me out. But when they called me out, it was different than how they would do it with a white colleague. With me, they targeted my race, they targeted my sexuality. I've been called the N-word, a fairy, all types of things. And so Trump just created this environment to make it okay to target journalists of color and women in a certain vicious way. And ultimately, it made it very challenging to do our jobs, because it for some, it makes you question, how do I move forward? Do I stand back? Do I not report this story because of the harassment that I might get by tackling this story? But ultimately, I think that Trump's attacks have inspired journalists to dig deeper and to dig their heels into the sand and say, I'm not going to back down. And I think that is courageous.
Indeed. And just very quickly with respect to your question, I do think that, people being in marginalized groups, and therefore, I think it makes it easier, unfortunately, for people like Trump and those who, would, hate on the media, for lack of a better expression. It makes it easier for them to do so. It makes us easier targets. And I think that does have an effect on the entire press. But one of the things that I think that was heartening was not only Yamiche, continuing to do her job and doing it admirably, but also people having her back within the industry. And I think that, the more that we can all stick together within the press, not merely, backing each other with, supportive statements, but also, following up and saying, hey, no, wait, you need to answer her question first. Those kind of moments. We need more of that within our own ranks. I think it's going to make things, if not actually safer, certainly feel safer for journalists who are in the most marginalized groups.
Well, thank you, Kimberly, for asking such an amazing question. The panelists, thank you for engaging. Kimberly is one of our superstars on campus, so we're fortunate to have her here asking a question to such an esteemed panel. I want to transition to we have a number of questions in Q&A, and I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of these. And so one is from Maria, who wants to know, we touched on this, but how do news organizations navigate being both the quote unquote spreaders of information and a business, and how should they?
I would say that's a question for publishers in some cases. Usually there's a wall of separation between those who sell advertising and those who do the reporting, right? So thankfully that's a question that goes way over our heads that we don't have to think about, and we shouldn't have to think about necessarily traffic counts and what, how this specifically connects to the money being made and the revenues coming in either through subscriptions or ads. But that's really a question for editors in chief, for publishers, to create an environment where where the reporters can do the best work, and also, create a sustainable business model, which are two things that are very, very difficult to do in tandem.
I have a question also from Sidra. What role/responsibility does the media have in bringing increasingly distant poles of the political spectrum closer together, given that people on the left and the right are largely not consuming the same news?
I'll take that one, if only to be provocative. I'll say zero. We're a mirror. We're not here to fix society. We're here to reflect it. And so if people are divided and polarized and at each other's throats, that's a story we tell. but we're not here to fix it. It's up to people to fix it if they think it's a problem. Some people don't think it's a problem. Some people think that it's better to have, and there have certainly been a lot of moments, speaking of marginalized communities and race in particular, there have been a lot of moments in our history where a sort of false consensus, a false sense of unanimity and kumbaya has papered over a lot of really serious oppression. So it's not inherently a good thing to have a society that appears on the surface not to be divided. But I think it's important that we're not activists for that or any other cause, frankly, and maybe some people on the opinion side of the media feel differently and do want to be performing that work, but I think reporters are here to hold up a mirror to society, not to try and make it better.
And to speak up for those of us on the opinion side, I think I agree completely with Molly. I don't think it's our role to be doing this, but also even as we're writing columns or offering commentary, I think it's incumbent upon us to rely upon a common set of facts. And I think that while it's not our responsibility to fix this, I think we can be helpful. If we in fact just simply do our jobs to the best of our ability, and that includes writing opinion that's based on reporting, that's based on facts, and making sure that people get more than simply just random off the cuff take. We need to make sure that we're doing substantive work.
This question reminds me of one of my favorite quotes about journalism, is that we can't tell people what to think, but we can tell people what to think about. We shouldn't tell people what to think. We should, we have the opportunity in these positions to raise issues and get people thinking. Now, to Molly's point, if there's something important in society that is fueling horrible things, then our role is to shine a light on it and to point out what's happening, not to say do this or do that.
It seems like one of the challenges to shining a light has been just the proliferation of voices that occur via social media. And so one question from Larissa, as we shift away from traditional news mediums, print and cable news, what are going to be the most effective ways to convey political journalism going forward? And I'm going to add a little bit to the question, especially making sure that we have truth, fact-based information circulating to wide audiences as we transition away from the more traditional mediums. This is a fun part in class when everybody's kind of like,
It was almost kind of like a loaded question, if you will.
Yeah, what can we do to, I guess, what can we do to make social media, I guess, in the circulation of news and information via social media and these other more like digital platforms, follow some of the same standards that we've held the traditional news outlets to, making sure that that things are fact-based, that things are checked, that we follow the right experts and not people who are sort of just like, the loudest people with the most followers.
I think that with social media, a lot of them actually started to do that on their own, actually trying to vet some of the information that was out there. I think essentially that was a big part of with the president being censored at one point. I think that they've also just been trying to do their own thing. You look at Facebook, also checking, you'll see sometimes a little thing that says fact checked or something like that popping up. So I think that that's a lot of doing it on their own, the organizations, but also with us when we're going to put out our information as well, to just kind of put it on, whether it's our news pages or us as just regular journalists posting it on our social media pages to kind of dispel those myths earlier that I mentioned as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think fact checking is really important on social media. The other thing I think is important as people are more and more on Twitter is that you want to keep the same standards that you do in your news writing. You don't want to have it that you are writing an article that comes across, straight down the center, and then people go to your Twitter and it seems like you're spouting off various opinions or making it very clear which side of an issue you're on. And I think that that is an area that has been a difficult line for a lot of journalists to figure out over the years. But I think it's something that's really important that we focus on, because you want people to be able to trust the news they're getting and feel like, there's not some secret world where you can find out, what reporters really think when you go on Twitter.
I think Rebecca makes an important point. I think it's incumbent upon journalists to control our own behavior. But I do think with regards to the companies, again, that's another thing that is not our job to fix. I think, to some degree, my opinion is that the behavior has to be disincentivized. And so what that means, their inaction or sometimes their poor decisions in terms of containing these negative forces on social media. So, frankly, I think it's more of a question for, our elected officials than it is, for people covering them.
I have a question from Maya that I think is just really interesting. We've touched on it, but this is more pointed. How do you as journalists keep your personal beliefs out of your reporting, especially when reporting on an issue that hits close to home? And we can think of a number of issues that have hit close to home for us, respectively, especially over the course of the last few years. How do you strike that balance?
I would say, and not to keep speaking first, but I would say to me, it's all about reporting the facts, right? We have the information, we know the facts, and that's what our jobs are, no matter how much of an opinion I have. I mean, you think back to the Ahmaud Arbery story and everyone, posting that they're running with Ahmaud, the 2.26 miles or 2.23 miles. And you think about like, your family members. I know personally for me, whether it's my brothers or my dad or whoever, you can't help but feel like yourself, and that this could be any one of your family members or your friends. So it is hard, I would say, to actually be able to not say anything. But I think we also do well at being able to kind of post in a way that shows that we also still stand with our community, but not in a way of really sharing our opinions, but showing that we hurt when we see certain things happen to our community. So I think it's kind of like a twofold thing where we have to decide what we can actually say. That's obviously reporting the facts, but also it's okay to show some type of emotion because we're human at the end of the day.
Piggyback off of Brittany, we are human, and so I can't write a story about racism, for example, and not be impacted as a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
I can't write about a story about a trans person being murdered when I'm a part of the LGBTQ community. And so for me, in terms of objectivity, I can write a story. I can have an opinion and still write a story and make sure that all the voices, all the actors in the story are represented. There was a story today about a racist woman in New York who called a bakery worker the N-word because he refused to offer her services because she was not wearing a mask. And she went to social media to express her side of the story. And she said, I love all people. I was just upset. And we reported the story. It was a racist incident and we shared what she wrote. But I can still go on social media and share how I feel as Gerren, the person outside of the work that I do. And I think that that's challenging. I think that deciding on what I want to speak on publicly as a journalist in terms of race and the separation from reporting the story. But I think it's not rocket science to me. I think it's very possible to be objective in the work that you do and still have opinions about it.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would note, Jonathan, is that, I mean, the obvious thing is to talk to sources on all sides of the issues and make sure you understand it. We all get that, but I think less obvious is that I think it is helpful for reporters to have empathy for our subjects and to have empathy for all subjects in a story, because we'll never fully understand them if we don't have that empathy. And even if someone even if a reporter is covering someone who they think is a total monster, it helps to see the humanity in them and to understand where they're coming from, because you'll see things that you wouldn't otherwise see if you don't force yourself to do that.
With the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you a question just about what we can do to essentially create more of you. So my class is mainly focused on education policy. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what types of curricular changes or policy-related changes should be put in place to increase the pool of journalists, to diversify the pool of journalists that are coming behind you? What are some of the things that we can do as a society, and especially thinking about maybe our public education system, our higher education system, to make the journalism career a more sort of a more frequently taken road or frequently taken pathway?
I would say for me, Morehouse College is where my career started. The school newspaper, there's a journalism program there. And so I would say more funding, especially for HBCUs. If to see more Gerrens out there, we need to ensure that HBCUs in all colleges are funded, because we already know the challenges for journalism in terms of economics. But I think creating programs and keeping programs alive on college campuses is where you find young, talented journalists and future talented journalists. That's where you find them.
I generally believe it's irresponsible to encourage anybody to go into journalism, considering the state of the field. You're probably signing up for a life of poverty and unemployment, and we don't need the competition, frankly. So I would say don't do it. But on a less facetious note, I mean, we do need more Gerrens, right? We do need a more diverse profession, and we do need smart, talented people going into journalism. And so I do think that on an academic level, the best thing is just to have students reading a lot. And that's maybe my bias because I'm a print journalist, right? But I do think that, we've talked a lot about how people are trying to decipher their media environment when there's no Walter Cronkite, right? And I think I have a lot of compassion for our consumers. It's very confusing, and we're asking them to understand something new every day. And the media landscape is always changing, and they don't know who to trust, and they don't know who to trust to tell them who to trust. And so they end up believing politicians and cult leaders instead. And I think the solution to that, if there is one, is just to have good people coming into the profession who are smart and well-grounded, and who get a grounding from whatever their economic background academic background, but also economic, in what journalism means, what our values are, what we're trying to do here. Because a lot of the problems that we're talking about are just people not understanding what we're trying to do here, people having suspicions that we have ulterior motives, or that we are guided by our corporate masters, right? When we're just folks trying to figure stuff out, and we are walled off from a lot of that financial stuff, hopefully. But the more people can understand about what we do and go into it because they want to contribute to that project of reporting the truth, the better.
I'll say from my own personal experience, teaching or offering public policy courses and encouraging them in undergrad can make a huge difference. It made all the difference in the world for me. In my junior and senior years, I took courses in healthcare policy and in inequality politics, public policy, that sort of thing. And I graduated in the middle of the Great Recession in 2009, which was a horrible time for journalism. Industries collapsing, massive layoffs everywhere. It could have been a terrible, terrible decision that I made to go into journalism. I couldn't really resist it. And the only reason I think I survived in it is because I had learned a lot about healthcare policy, and there happened to be a big healthcare debate happening in 2009, which was the way I was able to differentiate myself. So one of the things that I do think is missing in Washington, D.C. is people who can, people who are good reporters, who understand politics and who also understand public policy very well. That's an excellent niche for students who are thinking about going into journalism.
And I would add to that, I think it's really important that universities encourage people who are studying for other fields, medicine. They're studying to be, architects. They're studying to be engineers. Encourage them to also be participatory in journalism. Encourage them to be on the paper. We need people who have life experience in these fields in order, to be, helping us not merely as quotes and as sources, but also as experts who are writing, who are offering reporting. You know, I have a friend who, you know, is a medical doctor, used to work for the CDC, but she's also a journalist. And knowing that she has both of those skills, I think frankly helps the audience, you know, take what she's putting forth a little bit more seriously.
I think companies could do a lot more partnering with universities, especially when we talk about on the diversity side, because if they are looking for more and more Black and Brown journalists, one of the ways to do that is making sure they have those programs at these different universities and colleges to be able to kind of give them a full tunnel to funnel those kids into their news stations or just media companies, period. Because that's how we know it kind of starts with them looking across the board and what they want to do with their staff, that ultimately they could be looking down already at the up and coming journalists and have just a partnership that's kind of funneling them into the to their companies. And I think that'll be a way to make sure that they're getting more and more people on their staffs, and you get those hungry journalists who are coming right out of college. And even if it's like a training program or something like that, that will be able to get them that early experience, that would also help diversify their newsrooms early on. And then also us knowing that those programs exist on campuses, you're more likely to join something to say, you know what, I could potentially have a job coming out of college, and that helps spark that interest as well.
The other thing that I think is really important for getting a broader set of backgrounds into the field is to make sure that people don't have to choose between working at their student newspaper in college and getting a job that pays. So I think these like financial aid programs for college newspapers are really important for that reason, because, you know, I had the luxury of spending maybe 20 hours a week sometimes at my college newspaper office at the Brown Daily Herald. And it shouldn't be that you can only do that if you can afford to not have a part-time job.
Wow, I think that offers a range of ideas. The fact that this event is being recorded, I hope interested parties really take up these ideas and champion them. I think it would be great to see, you know, the field of journalism continue to look like this Zoom room is looking tonight. I just want to give a special thank you again to you all, the panelists, to our guests, Sahil, Kapur, Brittany Jones, Rebecca Ballhaus, Molly Ball, Jamil Smith, and Gerren Gaynor. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We hope to continue to have these types of events. We'd love to eventually do this event replicated in person once things sort of return to normal. Thank you all. Thank you to Professor Ehrenberg and the Taubman Center here at Brown University and the Brown University community. You know, journalists, the media, print, this is our unofficial fourth branch. It's our unofficial fourth branch for a reason. It's very important to the vibrancy of our democracy. And over the past 4+ years, we've seen that branch take acts after acts after acts. And so I thought it was very important to have this conversation to talk about the damage that has been done, but then also the ways in which we can be creative and innovative and to make sure that it's restored and is stronger than it was before. Thank you, panelists, for presenting us with your experiences, your observations, your expertise, and your ideas. Everyone, thank you for being a part of this panel. Have a good night.